Record.
Okay. Well, welcome back, folks. We are deep into our study of Ozarks history. And last week, we saw how Henry Rose Schoolcraft came into the Ozarks, winter of 1818, 1819, and journeyed for about 90 days, about 900 miles, wrote up his journal, and that gives us a look at what the Ozarks looked like when there were only just at the best, a couple of hundred settlers in the Ozarks. Gives us an idea of the type of animal life, type of plant life. And on top of that, it stimulated further settlement. That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the stimulation of settlement and the early settlement of the Ozarks by, for lack of a better term, Americans. Because remember, at this time now, the Ozarks is part of the Louisiana Purchase, and so it has become part of the United States. So we're going to talk about American settlement today, at least the early aspects of it. I always spotlight famous Ozarker, and got a young man here. Obviously, he's a hill boy. He's got his overalls on. He's got his pencil in his pocket. Got his buck teeth, and I'll bet some of you, if you look hard enough, you'll probably recognize him. He came from West Plains, Missouri, and of course, he became Porter Wagoner, one of the all-time greats of country music. Helped generate the career of Dolly Parton, and was for years and years one of the standouts on the Grand Ole Opry. It was my privilege to be the Grand Ole Opry twice, and got to see Porter both times, as well as some of the other greats like Roy Acuff and all. But that's our Ozarker for today, Porter Wagoner, the country music star. So, what can we say about American settlement? Well, before Schoolcraft's exploration, there was already people beginning to move towards the Ozarks. And like I said, probably by 1820 or so, there were at least a couple hundred, it's hard to tell, but somewhere in the small hundreds of people living in the Ozarks at this point. Well, Schoolcraft's exploration most definitely generated excitement, but there were other factors that were contributing to the early settlement of the Ozarks. And these included, number one, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And I'll kind of show you how that works and what happened there. Another one was the New MADRID earthquake of 1811 and 1812. And finally, the War of 1812. So these three specific events really had a lot to do with the early settlement of the Ozarks. So let's see how. After the British lost their American colonies in the Revolutionary War, there were many Americans continued to move west of the Mississippi River. That was due in part because of the passage of the Northwest Ordinance. That was one of the very first ordinances that set up the territories of what we now know as Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, that area. Here's a map. These were the Northwest Territories set up by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. A particular note, all of these were restricted from having slaves. That was part of the Northwest Ordinance, that slavery could not be allowed in these states. These were free states. Well, people in these states that were territories had slaves, some of them did. And all of a sudden, they are in a position where they have to do one of two things. They either have to, well, I guess one of three things. Either number one, they have to sell their slaves to somebody in a slave state, or number two, they have to free them, or number three, they have to move in order to keep them. So, I'm sure some people did just some of that. Some of them freed them, some of them sold them. A lot of people chose to move that owned slaves. Well, if you look at the map, you can see that one of the areas that was probably an area where a lot of people moved from the Northwest Territory was into Missouri. Now, no doubt that most of the slave owners lived along the Missouri River and along the Mississippi River. There was not a lot of slaves in the northern part of Missouri, and there most certainly were not a lot in the Ozarks, because again, it was a pretty remote and rugged area. But there nevertheless were some people that began to move towards the Ozarks and eventually would move into the Ozarks with slaves. Not a lot. The Ozarks, particularly the southern part of Missouri, was never a great slaveholding area. We're going to talk about that in a few weeks. But, just to let you know that was one of the stimulants towards moving towards the Ozarks. So law forbids slavery in the new territories, and that proved to be an inducement, as again, like I said, for slaveholders to move into there. And again, they chose mostly the fertile river valley areas like the Missouri and the Mississippi River. The Missouri River Valley particularly was home to a lot of slave owners, and that got the nickname Little Dixie. That was where most of the tobacco and the hemp, these were the crops that were raised primarily along the Missouri River Valley. Not so much cotton. The soil and the climate was not really conducive to cotton in the Missouri River Valley. Into the southern parts of the Mississippi River Valley, then you begin to get into the cotton areas. So as these Americans moved in, they begin to settle. And so you begin to see new American settlements. Now remember, settlements were Spanish and French. Now we begin to see settlements primarily made up of Americans. St. Charles, Missouri was primarily an American settlement, as was Cape Girardeau in the southeastern part of the state. New Madrid, 1793. By the way, it is New Madrid. It is not New Madrid. It's pronounced that way if you're out of the Ozarks. New Bourbon, which became Bourbon, Missouri, also in 1793. And what we now know as Fredericktown, but it was called St. Michael's in 1800. So these were some of the first large American settlements in, right on the fringes of the Ozarks. Here's a picture of Old St. Charles. It's a beautiful old city downtown. If you've never been there, you most certainly ought to go. I know some of my listeners, I can see St. Charles there, so I know some of you have been there, obviously. But it's a beautiful part of old downtown. Been restored, a lot of it, a lot of shops. My wife loves St. Charles. She would go there every day if I would take her. Okay, so the second stimulation besides the Northwest Ordinance was the New Madrid earthquake. We're going to spend a little bit of time on the New Madrid earthquake. I've got a fairly long video to show you about it because it's a really interesting area. Now, you might ask yourself, why would an earthquake stimulate development? You might ask yourself, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You would think it would scare people away. Well, what happened was this. If you don't know, and I'm sure some of you do, that in the winter of 1811, 1812, the most really strongest earthquake to ever hit the North American continent hit at New Madrid, Missouri, down on the southeastern section, right on the edge of the Ozarks, along the Mississippi River Valley. The main quake was December 15th, but there was a series of aftershocks that lasted over 2 months. And like I said, it is still considered to be the strongest earthquake to ever hit the North American continent. Nobody knows for sure how strong it was because they did not have the scientific instrumentation that they do today to gauge it. But from the reports and from what has been learned about it, most scientists say it was anywhere from a 9 to a 10. That's a gigantic earthquake, folks. When we think of earthquakes in the United States, we almost always immediately go to California. We think, well, that's where all the earthquakes are. Most people don't realize that the largest earthquake fault and the one that could potentially cause the most damage lies in Missouri. and Arkansas. In fact, the case, I don't know if you've read the news or you've watched the news, but just this past weekend, they had a 3.9 earthquake in northeast Arkansas, at a little town called Imboden. I know it well. We used to go to Florida quite often, and that was on our route to Florida. We go through Imboden. It's just a little town up in the mountains, but had a 3.9 earthquake. Those are pretty routine, 3 to 4 earthquakes. We don't usually feel them here in the western part of the Ozarks. On occasion, we do. The scientists, of course, are very concerned that someday there's going to be a really, really strong earthquake hit. In fact, the case most scientists think we're past due for a new earthquake to hit in the New MADRID region, and it could be pretty devastating if it happens. The one that hit December the 15th, 1811, completed almost complete devastation with a 30-mile radius. Now, you got to think about this, folks. 1811, there weren't a lot of people around. It was a fairly remote area, and it was huge. It was big enough that it created Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee, which is still there. My son-in-law goes fishing on Reelfoot Lake on occasion from St. Louis. The Mississippi River reportedly ran backwards for a period of time. It was so large that it caused the river to actually run backwards. As I said, fortunately, due to the sparse settlement, there was relatively little loss of life or structural damage. So, how did this stimulate movement into the Ozarks? Well, it's really very simple. People that lived there that was able to prove that there was, loss, they granted them 600 acres of land in the Louisiana territory. They said anybody that lost property because of the earthquake, and you can prove it to us, which was pretty easy to do, they said, we'll automatically give you 600 acres of land, so anywhere in the Louisiana territory you want. The most obvious choice for a lot of them was to move west into what we now call the Ozarks, either in northwest Arkansas or in the southwest Missouri. And that's exactly what happened. So you begin to see movement westward into the Ozarks as a result of these land grants being given because of the New MADRID earthquake. Again, since the choicest lands of the Mississippi and Missouri River Valley had been claimed, most of them ended up somewhere in the interior of the Ozarks. Now, I've got a video here, and it's pretty long. It's actually about 15 minutes long, but it's a really good video about the New MADRID earthquake. It kind of tells you all about it, some of the effects of it, and I thought you might be interested in watching this because this is one of the events that really kind of dominates early Ozarks history. So, with that being said, let's watch this.
In a letter dated March 20th, 1816, schoolteacher Eliza Bryan wrote to Methodist minister Lorenzo Dow, "The awful dark of the atmosphere, which was saturated with sulphurous vapor, the violence of the tempestuous thundering noise, and all the other phenomena formed a scene the description of which would require the most sublimely fanciful imagination." She was talking about an event that she witnessed on February 7th, 1812, the largest of what were called the New MADRID earthquakes. The largest earthquakes in U.S. history east of the Mississippi River are still somewhat of a mystery to both scientists and historians, but there were a few first-hand accounts from that sparsely populated land describing the events, and they painted a grim picture indeed. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Situated on an oxbow bend on the Mississippi River, the Missouri State Historical Society writes that New MADRID was the first American town in Missouri, although Missouri Life magazine notes that the site of New MADRID had been a prime location for local tribes long before the coming of the Europeans, and that the French arrived in the 17th century. The town, established as New MADRID in 1789, was established by land developer and American War for Independence veteran George Morgan. The Historical Society recalls, named for Madrid, Spain, the town was to be an American colony. Morgan was promised 15 million acres by the Spanish ambassador, eager to check U.S. expansion, with large land grants. The bend in the river was a natural landing point for boats on the river, and Missouri Life notes, the location seemed ideal for farming as well as fur trading because the land sat higher than that around it, ostensibly protected from river flooding. Settlement was difficult. The area was very remote, but a Spanish census in the 1790s showed a respectable 800 people living in the town. It was part of the vast territory of Louisiana, which had first seen European claim with the French, but had been handed to the Spanish in 1762 after the end of the French and Indian War. It had been handed by the Spanish back to the French in 1801, and then sold by the French to the United States in 1803. New Madrid, and it's not clear when the name pronunciation changed from Madrid to Madrid, was a growing river and farming community by 1811. Missouri Living explains, for years after the establishment of New Madrid, the settlers, French, British, and American, lived in their log and frame houses in relative security. By winter 1811, the bulk of the season's work had been done. Crops had been harvested, and supplies of food and stores of firewood had been laid in for the winter. The first shock came in December. Eliza Bryan writes, on the 16th of December, 1811, at about 2:00 a.m., we were visited by a violent shock of an earthquake. The screams of the frightened inhabitants running to and fro, not knowing where to go or what to do. The cries of the fowls and beasts of every species. The cracking of the trees falling. The roaring of the Mississippi, the current of which was retrograde for a few minutes, formed a scene truly horrible. Because, as United States Geological Survey notes, in the central and eastern regions of the United States, the seismic energy experiences a low rate of absorption. The earthquakes centered around New Madrid were felt over a very great distance. USGS contrasts the effects of a Midwestern earthquake as opposed to earthquakes on the West Coast, where the Earth's crust better absorbs earthquake energy. Can be estimated that in the New Madrid earthquakes, the area of intensity 5 or greater effects was approximately 2.5 million square kilometers. This can be contrasted with the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, for which the area of intensity 5 or greater effects was about 150,000 square kilometers. John Reynolds, who would later become governor of Illinois, wrote in his autobiography that his family felt the earthquake 230 miles away in the town of Vincennes, Illinois. He said, our family was all sleeping in a cabin, and my father leaped up and screamed, the Indians are at our door. We all laughed at my father's mistake, but we soon found out it was worse than the Indians. Following the initial quake in December, Bryan wrote that the earth was in constant agitation, with another major shock on January 23rd. But the worst came in February. On the 7th, about 4:00 a.m., a concussion took place so much more violent than those which had preceded it, that it was denominated the hard shock. Matthias M. Speed was a riverboat captain, one of many plying trade down the Mississippi River. On the night of February 6th, he had tied off to a willow bar, a copse of trees on the shore north of New Madrid. As was a common practice, they had lashed off to another river barge for the night. His account was printed in several newspapers. About 3:00 in the morning of the 7th, we were waked by the violent agitation of the boat, attended with a noise more tremendous and terrific than I can describe, or anyone can conceive who was not present or near to such a scene. The constant discharge of heavy cannon may give some idea of the noise for loudness, but this was infinitely more terrible on account of its appraising to be subterraneous. Bryan wrote that at first the Mississippi seemed to recede from its banks and its waters gathering up like a mountain, leaving for a moment many boats, which were here on the way to New Orleans, on the bare sand. It then rising 15 or 20 feet perpendicularly and expanding, as it were, at the same moment, the banks were overflown with retrograde current, rapid as a torrent. Speed took his boat into the river as the trees at the shore were falling, but he reported, after getting out so far as to be out of danger from the trees which were falling from the bank, the swells from the river were so great as to threaten the sinking of the boat every moment. Speed was not the only one whose boat was in danger. A newspaper from Lexington, Kentucky reports one gentleman, Mr. Vatner, states that the earthquake that occurred during the night of the 7th occasioned his barge, with 600 barrels of flour besides other articles, to sink, and the whole was lost. Vatner was also quoted in the Pennsylvania Gazette saying, they were on shore 5 miles below New Madrid on Friday morning, the 7th, instant at the time of the hard shock, and the water filled their barge and sunk it with the whole of its contents, losing everything but the clothes they had on. They offered at New Madrid half their loading for a boat to save it, but no price was sufficient for the hire of a boat. The Kentucky newspaper reported that another gentleman whose name is not recollected stated that during the convulsion, the bank of the river just below New Madrid caved in and let loose his boat, about which at the same time there was a back current in the river which drove the boat several miles up a small bayou. During the convulsion, the motion of the boat was so violent as to stave many of the barrels of flour in the boat. The quaking continued 3 days, when this gentleman, thinking it prudent to not go further, left his property and returned. The effects on the river were dramatic. Speed, still lashed to the other barge, fought the raging river till daybreak, but during all this time we had made only about 4 miles downriver, from which circumstance, and from that of an immense quantity of water rushing into the river from the wood, it is evidence that the earth at this place or below had been raised so high as to stop the progress of the river and cause it to overflow its banks. Bryan continued that the river, falling immediately as rapidly as it has risen, receded within its banks again with such violence that it took with it whole groves of young cottonwood trees, which lodged its borders. Perhaps more frightening for the boats on the river, the movement of the river created sudden obstacles. Speed said, "We took the right-hand channel of the river at this island, and having reached within about a half-mile of the lower end of the town, we were frightened with the appearance of a dreadful rapid or falls in the river just below us. We were too far in the suck that it was impossible to now land. All hopes of surviving was now lost, and certain destruction appeared to await us. The new obstacle was massive," he continued. "From the state of alarm that I was in, I cannot pretend to be correct as to the length or height of the falls, but my impression is that they were about equal to the rapids of the Ohio. Yet the 2 barges managed to survive the rapids, keeping their bows forward. But another crew did not do as well," he reported. "There was one boat coming down on the same morning I landed. When they came inside of the falls, they were so frightened of the prospect that they abandoned their boat and made for the island in their canoe. 3 managed to make it to the river bank, but 1 man was stuck on the island, with the rest of the crew too afraid to brave the river to rescue him." Speed says he remained on the island from Friday morning until Sunday evening, when he was taken off by a canoe from a boat coming down. There the man experienced the terror, the quakes, aftershocks. "I was several days in company with this man. He stated that during his stay on the island, there were frequent eruptions in which sand and stone, coal and water were thrown up. The violent agitation of the ground was such that at one time it had induced him to hold to a tree to support himself. The earth gave way at the place, and he with the tree sunk down, and he got wounded in the fall." The rapids that Speed encountered were not the only ones. He wrote that later at New Madrid, there were upwards of 20 boats landed, all of whom spoke of the rapids above. Several persons who came up the river in a small barge represented that there were falls in the Mississippi about 7 miles below New Madrid, principally on the eastern side, more dangerous than those above, and that some boats had certainly been lost in attempting to pass them. A report in the Pennsylvania Gazette wrote, "It is said that a falls equal to that of the Ohio is near New Madrid, and that several whirls are in the Mississippi River, some so strong as to sink every boat that comes within its suck. 1 boat was sunk, with a family in it." The reports of 2 men in a Kentucky newspaper concurred. Both these gentlemen state that some obstruction has presented itself in the river, something like a rapid or falls, which greatly endangers navigation. There is a certainty that a bar composed of stone coal, burnt substances, and etc. has been thrown up directly under the bed of the river. Island number 8, from the junction of the Ohio to the Mississippi, is entirely sunk. Indeed, the effects already ascertained are terrible. The inundations are progressing through the lowlands. The shocks are now running up the river and through what is called the American Bottom. It is not known how many people died, but it's assumed that many drowned in the river. Eliza Bryan noted that the river was literally covered with the wrecks of boats, and that it was said that 1 boat was wrecked that had on it a lady and 6 children, all of whom were lost. The town of New Madrid, which had been trying to rebuild after the previous shocks, faced what seemed to be a final deadly blow. Speed reported, "We landed at New Madrid about breakfast time. The appearance of the town and the situation of the inhabitants was such as to afford but little relief to our minds. There was scarcely a house left entire, some wholly prostrated, others unroofed, and not a chimney standing." A newspaper from Russellville, Kentucky wrote, "We have seen a statement made by a couple of gentlemen just from New Madrid, which says that the place is much torn to pieces by the late earthquake, so much so that it is almost impossible to get along in any way, but entirely so on horseback. The houses of brick, stone, and log are torn to pieces, and those of frame thrown up on their sides." Not only was the town in ruins, but it had literally sunk, leaving it threatened by the river. Speed reported that the former elevation of the bank on which the town stood was estimated at about 25 feet above common water. When we reached it, the elevation was only about 12 or 13 feet. A report from Russellville, Kentucky said, "The ground near the place for 100 acres has sunk so low that the tops of the tallest trees can barely be seen above the water. In other places, more than half the length of the timber is underwater. Reports from survivors who had arrived in Lexington, Kentucky said in innumerable places is opened large fissures, and the inhabitants of New Madrid entertained the opinion that the ground on which the town stood has sunk about 15 feet. This threat had compelled most of the inhabitants of the area to abandon the town. Speed said, the people, having all deserted their habitations, were in camps and tents back of the town, and their little watercraft, such as skiffs, boats, and canoes, hauled out of the water to their camps that they might be ready in case the country might sink. The Lexington paper reported, also the buildings in New Madrid are greatly damaged. Much of the land round about was underwater, and the few remaining inhabitants were encamped out. The witnesses quoted in the Russellville paper said the town of New Madrid has sunk 12 feet below its former standing, but is not covered with water. The houses are all thrown down, and the inhabitants have moved off, except for the French, who live in camps close to the riverside, have their boats tied near them in order to sail off in case the earth should sink. Still, New Madrid was better off than the tiny town of Little Prairie. The Lexington paper wrote, the land where the town of Little Prairie stands is 16 feet underwater. Missouri Life magazine describes the odyssey of the inhabitants of this wrecked town. That night, Little Prairie residents abandoned their homes. Unaware that New Madrid had been devastated by the same natural disaster, the refugees set on foot for the 30-odd-mile journey to New Madrid. The clearly marked trail was no more, beset with crevices and fissures, felled trees, and newly made quicksand bogs with muddy water that went from shallow to deep without warning. The settlers dodged panicked snakes and other creatures desperately seeking safety, as were the settlers, from the unpredictable toil. The situation of the survivors was, paper reported, desperate. The Russellville report said, the citizens have flown to the mountains and were, when the informants left there, waiting for an opportunity to move to Kentucky. It is said they are near 1,000 in number. Merciful God, what a horrible situation. 1,000 sufferers collected together without any means of subsisting, having escaped from the ruins with nothing but their lives and clothes. Still threatened with a like catastrophe to which they have escaped, and above all, are suffering for food. The picture is too horrid to dwell upon. Our sympathy is with them, and our prayers presented for their delivery. It's really remarkable, given how sparse the population was at the time, that so many clear accounts remain. And these terrifying accounts by both river travelers and local residents demonstrate the awesome power of this earthquake that the United States Geological Survey notes was felt south to the Gulf Coast, southeast to the Atlantic coast, and northeast to Quebec, Canada. Speed wrote that in the period after the February 7th earthquake, aftershocks came every 20 to 30 minutes. And Eliza Bryan wrote that in 1816, 4 years after the major earthquake, that the shocks continued, although she said that they were becoming more light and less frequent. It took a very long time for New Madrid to recover. The Missouri Life magazine notes that a quarter century after the quake, the population was down to just 450 people. But Eliza Bryan noted that most of the people who fled the country in the time of the hard shock came home. As a result of the quakes, in 1814, Missouri Territorial Governor William Clark convinced Congress to pass the nation's first Disaster Relief Act. The act provided that anyone who lost land during the earthquake could receive a land certificate redeemable for between 160 and 640 like acres of public land elsewhere in Missouri. The earthquake coincided with the Great Comet of 1911, an exceptionally bright comet visible with the naked eye. The coincidence of a portentous comet and the wrath of God in the form of the earthquakes affected the nation. Missouri Life writes, earthquake Christians, as they came to be called, suddenly sought to get right with God as membership in local Methodist and Baptist churches soared. According to historian David W. Fletcher, preachers attested significant numbers of baptisms and conversions, since sinners wanted to avoid further outpourings of God's wrath. As one minister recalled, it was a time of great terror for sinners. The description of the event in 1812 provides a stark warning today. As the U.S. Geological Survey says, continuing minor to moderate seismic activity in the central Mississippi Valley area is an indication that a large magnitude tremor can someday be expected there again. Although exactly when such a quake might occur is, the survey writes, difficult to answer, the survey wrote in 1974 that a repeat of the 1811-1812 quakes would result in a much greater loss of life and property today, because of the much larger number of people and man-made structures in the region than were there 162 years ago. The risk isn't lost on the people of New Madrid today. Missouri Life magazine notes that the residents of the town, whose population hovers around 3,000, tends to look at the geological possibilities philosophically. One observer, the magazine writes, sums up the town's sense of both caution and inevitability. Its citizens, the observer says, keep one eye on the Mississippi and one eye on the hills. But perhaps, the U.S. Geological Survey notes, the greatest risk of all comes from the sense of complacency, or perhaps total ignorance of the potential threat of a large earthquake. Just another reason that history deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on the History Guy Guild.
Okay, so quite a long little video there, but I thought it was really interesting about the earthquake. And just think about this, folks. This earthquake rang the bells in churches in Boston. It was that hard. I don't know if you caught it, that the earthquake of New Madrid was so strong and had such an effect is because of the bedrock that exists in the Ozarks. If you go out to California, the ground absorbs the shock. Here, the shock is radiated because of the bedrock. So it's really a much more significant event in the Ozarks, and hopefully that's something none of us will ever have to worry about. But it's something that is part of history, and it's definitely something to remember. Here's an example. Here's Reelfoot Lake. Lake was formed. That was not there before the New Madrid earthquake. That was a new lake. It was formed totally. That kind of shows you the seismic zone map of the New Madrid earthquake. And you can see that this here is labeled an 8, and that's a 7. Most historians and scientists think it may have been a 10, as high as a 10. And you'll notice that it extended clear over into Kansas as a 4. That's a pretty heavy earthquake for people in Kansas. We don't have any photographs, obviously, of the New Madrid earthquake because it happened before photography existed. But here is an earthquake picture that took place in Charleston. Charleston is not too far from New Madrid, and not Charleston, South Carolina, but Charleston, Missouri. And it's also located in the Boot Hill. And this occurred, I think, in the 1890s. This is just a house that was basically leveled as a result of one of the earthquakes that occurred in the Boot Hill. So that leaves us one event, the War of 1812. You might ask yourself, how did a war stimulate population growth in the Ozarks? Well, much as happened with the earthquake, veterans their lost colonies. It failed, obviously, but many people volunteered for service in the War of 1812, and these people were often not paid because, to be very honest, the government didn't have a lot of money. So in return for service, they were granted land grants. They also did this for Revolutionary War veterans because a lot of the Revolutionary War veterans had never been paid. And so Congress passed a law granting land grants to anyone who served in the War of 1812 or the Revolutionary War. And so these people had new land grants. So many of the territories of the upland South becoming crowded, many chose to leave. If you lived in Tennessee, Kentucky, the Carolinas, this was an opportunity, if you owned land, to sell the land you lived on and move west into the Missouri Territory and get new land and have some money. If you didn't own land, then it gave you an opportunity to go and get land for free. So that really stimulated growth in the Ozarks. One of those people that took advantage of that was my great-great-great-grandfather, John. Now, I told you from the very beginning we started this, none of my ancestors are famous. None of them did anything important. They were all dirt farmers and moonshiners, and you name it, they did it. But I think it's important that we put a face on some of these settlers, and this is the ones I know the most about. So here was John Stephenson. His extended family traveled to the Ozarks in 1843, settled in present-day corner of what's known as Highway 14 and Nicholas Road in Nixon, Missouri. John Stevenson was an Ulsterite. He was a Scotch-Irish. He was born just south of Belfast, Ireland in 1787, and he immigrated to the United States around 1791, he and his younger brother. After getting married and scurrying around southern Pennsylvania, he ended up in Wythe County, Virginia, which is right on the border of Tennessee and Virginia. Raised a large family, got impatient because there were too many people moving in his mind, moved westward into what was known as Roane County, Tennessee, near a little town called Kingston, south of Knoxville. And then in 1813, he became a citizen and immediately joined the army to fight the British in the War of 1812. The Scotch-Irish had absolutely no love for the British. And when the British invaded again, they in vast numbers volunteered to fight against the British. That's what my great-great-grandfather John did. Served for 90 days. That was typical. That was not unusual. 90-day service. He was given a land grant for 160 acres. And in 1843, he and his extended family, several of his sons and their families, all moved to the Ozarks and settled on this land. Family traveled in a wagon train. Included, if you were to go to Nixa, you would still find these people there, the McConnells, the Gingers, the Brazils, the Yarboroughs. All these are some of the earliest settlers of what would become Christian County, Missouri. And like I said, he is one of my great paternal grandfathers. Now, I don't have a picture of John. I don't even have a picture of his son, Matthew. Well, I do have a picture earlier, but this was three of his grandsons. This is John S. Stevenson, named after his grandfather, John. This is Daniel, and this is Jacob. Jacob was my great-grandfather, and I never knew him. There's a close-up of him. Some people say I look a lot like him, and I guess if you look close enough, I kind of do. I do resemble my great-grandfather Jake quite a bit. Take that hat off and age him a little bit and put a goatee on him and whiten his hair, and he and I would probably look an awful lot alike. So another person that moved in was the Freeman family. One of these early settlers, as a result of all this, was Aaron Posey Freeman, and he settled on the North Fork River near Topaz Spring as early as 1833. Folks, that was very early on. There's a story that's written about Aaron Posey Freeman. He was a veteran of the War of 1812, so he got a land grant just like my great-great-grandfather John did. He also had a wife who was half Choctaw. As a result, she had a settlement from them selling their land in North Carolina, and they were from North Carolina. And so they moved west. They settled, first of all, in Crawford County, Missouri, and he decided that was getting too established, so he wanted to get somewhere deep into the woods. And so he traveled down and found a settlement along the North Fork River, went back, got his family, and it said it took him 28 days to cover the rough and untamed wilderness that was still occupied by Shawnee Indians. Aaron Posey Freeman was one of the first 10 settlers in what is now Douglas County, Missouri. Once he had staked out his claim, he built and operated one of the first grist mills in present-day Douglas County. It's called Topaz Mill. And guess what, folks? He is one of my great-great-grandfathers also on my mother's side. So, as I told you when we started this, my roots go way, way back. So this is how two of my families, the Freeman family on my mother's side and the Stevenson family on my father's side got here. That's the Topaz Mill. It still stands today, and it has been restored. So this thing was built clear back in the 1830s, and it's still standing today. And like I said, it's been restored. Quite an event. I've been there a few times, and it always brings back kind of memories to me that to think what these people went through to settle the Ozarks. So next week, we're going to talk about statehood. How did Missouri become a state? And obviously the Ozarks. And folks, that was quite a chaotic event. I think it's safe to say that of the 50 states of the Union, no state had a harder time becoming a state than did Missouri. It was absolutely a chaotic event, and it was all wrapped up in slavery. And eventually, it kind of was a precedent that helped, in the long run, promote the Civil War that would occur 40 years later to the year. So next week, we're going to talk about statehood and the chaotic events that occurred in Missouri and the Ozarks. So I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you've had a good time. Hope you've learned something. And don't get too scared about the earthquakes. Every time I talk about this, my daughter lives in St. Louis, and Dad, you're scaring me to death. I think we have a lot of things that probably can mitigate that now. So anyway, have a good time. Hello, Donna, I see you there.
Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah, it was really interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Rachel?
Thank you so much, Tony. And hey, we got that St. Charles shout out today. I heard when you're talking about St.
Sorry,
Charles.
I didn't hear you.
I said I heard that St. Charles shout out. That building's only about 10 minutes from Main Street.
Yes.
Yep.
Like I said, my wife loves St. Charles. She would go there every day if I would take her.
It's wonderful. Well,
It
good.
is. The beautiful old city. Yeah. Well, we'll see you all next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.